Stay with me, because what I'm about to walk you through isn't just another trade dispute or diplomatic spat. This is something fundamentally different. For the first time in modern history, an American president looked at the world's longest undefended border, at 175 years of peaceful coexistence, at the closest ally the United States has ever had, and said, essentially, we don't need you. Canada relies entirely on the US. We don't rely on Canada. Those were President Trump's exact words. Not a slip of the tongue, not taken out of context. A deliberate, calculated statement delivered with absolute certainty. And here's what makes this moment so extraordinary. He didn't just say it once. He's been saying it repeatedly, consistently, building an entire narrative around the idea that America would be better off if Canada simply became the 51st state. But here's the thing nobody's telling you. Here's what gets lost in the headlines and the heated rhetoric. That statement, we don't rely on Canada, might be the single most economically illiterate claim an American president has ever made on the world stage. And I'm going to prove it to you. Not with opinions or political spin, but with numbers so stark, so undeniable, that by the end of this, you'll understand exactly what's at stake when a superpower decides to ignore the mathematical reality of its own supply chains. Let me start with energy, because energy is where the fantasy of American independence collides head-on with the reality of American dependence. Every single day, 4.1 million barrels of Canadian crude oil cross the border into the United States. Not some days, not when it's convenient, every day. That's more oil than the United States imports from any other country on Earth. In 2024, Canada supplied 63% of all US crude oil imports. 63%. Think about that number. Nearly 2/3 of every barrel of foreign oil entering American refineries comes from Canada. Now, here's where it gets interesting. American refineries, particularly the massive complexes along the Gulf Coast, aren't designed to run on just any crude oil. They're specifically configured to process heavy crude, the dense, sulfur-rich oil that comes from Canadian oil sands in Alberta. This isn't a matter of preference or convenience. These refineries were built, over decades, with billions of dollars in infrastructure investment to handle exactly this type of crude. When Trump says America doesn't need Canada, he's essentially claiming that the United States can replace 4 million barrels per day of heavy crude oil overnight. From where? Venezuela? Production there has collapsed. Mexico? Their output is declining year over year. The Middle East? Sure, technically possible, but you're talking about rebuilding supply chains, reconfiguring refinery operations, and oh, here's the small detail, relying on a region where stability is measured in weeks, not centuries. But it's not just crude oil. Canada supplies 98% of US natural gas imports. 98%. When American homes in the Midwest heat their houses in winter, when power plants in the Northeast generate electricity to keep the lights on, that energy is overwhelmingly flowing from Canadian pipelines. There are dozens of major pipelines connecting the two countries, built over decades, representing infrastructure investments that can't be replicated or replaced with a phone call or an executive order. And then there's electricity. Canada provides 82% of all electricity imported by the United States. Not half, not most, 82%. States like New York, Michigan, Minnesota, they're not just buying Canadian power as a nice supplement. They're depending on it to meet peak demand, to keep their grids stable, to prevent blackouts when consumption spikes. Let me put this in perspective. The entire energy relationship between the United States and Canada was valued at $151 billion in 2024. That's not a trade imbalance being exploited by cunning Canadian negotiators. That's American businesses, American utilities, American consumers choosing Canadian energy because it's reliable, it's close, and most importantly, it's exactly what their infrastructure is designed to use. So when Trump says we don't need Canada, What he's really saying is, we don't need 63% of our crude oil imports, we don't need 98% of our natural gas imports, and we don't need 82% of our electricity imports. Which is another way of saying, we don't need functioning refineries, we don't need heated homes in winter, and we don't need stable power grids. But energy is just the beginning. Let's talk about the broader trade relationship, because this is where the numbers become genuinely staggering. Canada was the top destination for US goods exports in 2024. Not the second largest, not in the top 5, the largest. American businesses exported $350 billion worth of goods to Canada last year. Meanwhile, the United States imported $413 billion from Canada. That's a trade deficit of roughly $62 billion in goods. Now, Trump loves talking about trade deficits, treating them as proof that America is being taken advantage of. But here's what that analysis completely misses. First, when you include services, not just goods, the US actually runs a surplus with Canada. Americans exported more services to Canada than they imported. The overall deficit shrinks to somewhere between $35 and $45 billion, depending on how you calculate it. But even that number is misleading, because it treats trade as a zero-sum game, where one side wins and the other loses. The reality is far more complex. About 50% of trade between the US and Canada isn't finished products being sold across the border. It's components, raw materials, intermediate goods crossing back and forth as part of integrated supply chains. Take the automotive industry. When a Chevy Silverado rolls off an assembly line in Michigan, components in that truck have crossed the US-Canada border multiple times during production. The steel might come from Ontario. It gets shipped to Ohio to be formed into parts. Those parts go back to Canada for additional processing. Then they return to the US for final assembly. That's not Canada exploiting America or America exploiting Canada. That's two economies so deeply intertwined that it's genuinely difficult to say where one ends and the other begins. This integration goes far beyond cars. In 2023, Canadian exports to the US represented 21% of everything Canada sold globally. Meanwhile, 76% of all Canadian merchandise exports were destined for the United States. Canada doesn't have the luxury of diversifying away from the American market overnight. The infrastructure doesn't exist, the relationships aren't there, the geography makes it nearly impossible. But here's what Trump seems to fundamentally misunderstand. That dependence cuts both ways. Yes, Canada relies heavily on the American market, but American businesses, American workers, American consumers are equally dependent on that trade flowing smoothly. When you impose 25% tariffs on your largest trading partner, you're not punishing them in isolation. You're disrupting your own supply chains, raising costs for your own businesses, and ultimately sending the bill to your own consumers. And we're watching that play out in real time. The tariffs Trump imposed in early 2025 hit Canada like an economic earthquake. By April, Canadian exports to the United States had plunged 26% from their January peak. 26%. That's not a trade adjustment, that's a collapse. Manufacturing output contracted. Export-dependent provinces like Ontario and Alberta saw businesses laying off workers, cancelling expansion plans, desperately searching for alternative markets that don't exist at the scale they need. But here's what the American media hasn't been covering nearly enough. Those tariffs didn't just hurt Canada. US imports overall fell 20% in April 2025, the largest single-month decline since the financial crisis of 2009, excluding the pandemic. Why? Because when you slap tariffs on half your imports, businesses can't instantly find domestic replacements. Supply chains don't reconfigure in weeks. Production capacity doesn't materialise because a president signs an executive order. American manufacturers suddenly paying 25% more for Canadian steel didn't celebrate. They absorbed the cost, crushed their profit margins, and quietly started planning layoffs. American consumers didn't notice immediately, but they will. Inflation, which had finally been cooling, is ticking back up. The Federal Reserve is watching nervously. Economists across the political spectrum are using words like self-inflicted wound and unforced error. And the consequences go far beyond economics. Let's talk about what happens when you treat your closest ally like an adversary. For the first time in modern history, a Canadian Prime Minister stood in front of his supporters and said Canadians now live in dark days brought on by a country we can no longer trust. That country is the United States, not Russia, not China, the United States of America. That's not political posturing. That's a fundamental rupture in a relationship that has for generations been the bedrock of North American security and prosperity. Trump hasn't just threatened tariffs, he's openly, repeatedly called for Canada to be annexed as the 51st state. He suggested using economic force to make it happen. He's mocked Canadian leaders, questioned Canada's sovereignty, and treated the entire country as if it's a property to be acquired in one of his real estate deals. The reaction in Canada has been predictable and frankly unprecedented. According to polling conducted in 2025, 90% of Canadians oppose annexation. 90%. In a country where people rarely agree on anything, you've got near universal consensus that becoming part of the United States is completely unacceptable. Another poll found that 82% of Canadians said they would rather become a dominion of the British Empire again than be annexed by the United States. Think about that for a moment. Canadians, who spent decades carefully building their own independent identity separate from Britain, would rather go back to being part of the Commonwealth than join the United States under these circumstances. Canadian nationalism has surged. There's been a massive spike in Buy Canadian campaigns. Consumers are actively avoiding American products. Businesses are quietly exploring ways to reduce their dependence on US markets. Canadian automobile trips to the United States are down 31% year over year, not because of gas prices or currency fluctuations, because Canadians are choosing not to spend their money in a country whose president treats them with open contempt. And it's not just symbolic. Canada has imposed retaliatory tariffs on $30 billion worth of US goods, with another $125 billion targeted if the trade war escalates further. Canadian provinces have threatened to cut off energy exports to certain US states. Think about what that means. Ontario floated the idea of cutting electricity to Michigan, Minnesota, and New York. They backed off, but the fact that it was even discussed shows how far this relationship has deteriorated. Meanwhile, Trump's annexation rhetoric, which initially seemed like trolling or negotiating theatre, has taken on a darker edge. He said, repeatedly, that Canada lives because of the United States. He's suggested that Canadians would be better off as Americans, paying lower taxes, enjoying perfect military protection. He's called Canadian leaders governors instead of prime ministers. This isn't diplomacy. It's not even bullying in the traditional sense. It's a fundamental denial of Canada's sovereignty, its legitimacy as an independent nation. And here's what's genuinely alarming. International observers are drawing comparisons they've never drawn before. Trump's statements about Canada are being compared to Putin's rhetoric about Ukraine before the invasion, Xi Jinping's language about Taiwan. The idea that a neighbouring country isn't really independent, that its sovereignty is conditional, that absorption is inevitable and even desirable. These comparisons might seem hyperbolic, but they're coming from serious foreign policy analysts, not partisan commentators. NATO allies are watching this with growing alarm. If the United States is willing to economically coerce Canada, its longest-standing ally, what does that say about American commitments to Estonia, Poland, any smaller nation that depends on US security guarantees? The entire rules-based international order that America spent 70 years building is predicated on the idea that treaties matter, that alliances are more than transactions, that sovereignty is inviolable regardless of relative power. When Trump says he might use economic force to acquire Greenland, when he floats military options for the Panama Canal, when he suggests Canada should be annexed, He's not just making controversial statements, he's systematically dismantling the perception that the United States can be trusted to uphold the norms it claims to champion. And once that perception is gone, it doesn't come back quickly, regardless of who sits in the Oval Office next. So let's bring this full circle. America doesn't need Canada? Let's test that claim seriously. Imagine for a moment that Canada stopped exporting energy to the United States tomorrow. Not likely, not politically feasible, but as a thought experiment. Refineries along the Gulf Coast would have to scramble to find 4 million barrels per day of heavy crude from somewhere. Venezuelan production is at historic lows. Mexican output is declining. Middle Eastern suppliers would need months, maybe years, to reconfigure shipping routes and refinery processes. In the meantime, gasoline prices would spike, heating costs would soar, and the political consequences would be immediate and severe. Now imagine Canada stopped exporting natural gas. Homes in the Midwest would be freezing in winter. Power plants in the Northeast would be scrambling to find alternative fuel sources. Rolling blackouts would become not just possible, but probable. The economic damage would be measured not in billions, but potentially trillions, as manufacturing slows, businesses shut down, and entire regions struggle to function. And these aren't hypothetical doomsday scenarios I'm inventing to make a point. These are the practical realities of what "we don't need Canada" actually means when you follow the logic to its conclusion. The United States has built its economy over decades on the assumption of Canadian reliability, that oil flows north to south, that natural gas moves through pipelines without disruption, that electricity crosses the border to keep the lights on, that steel, aluminum, lumber, and 1,000 other goods move freely as part of integrated supply chains. "We don't rely on Canada" isn't just wrong. It's so completely divorced from economic reality that it calls into question whether the person saying it understands how modern economies function at all. But here's the deeper question nobody's asking. What happens when you convince yourself you don't need something you actually depend on? What happens when national pride, political posturing, and sheer hubris override basic economic logic? History is full of examples, and they're never pretty. The Soviet Union convinced itself it didn't need market mechanisms. The result was decades of stagnation and eventual collapse. Britain convinced itself Brexit would be economically painless because other countries needed them more than they needed Europe. The result has been years of economic underperformance and growing realisation that interdependence isn't weakness, it's how modern economies prosper. America is now running the same experiment in real time. Can you maintain the world's largest economy while systematically alienating your closest trading partners? Can you impose tariffs on half your imports without triggering inflation, job losses, and economic contraction? Can you treat allies like adversaries and expect the rest of the world to continue viewing you as a reliable partner? The early results are not encouraging. Canada's economy contracted in the second quarter of 2025, the direct result of US tariffs. But the US economy is also slowing. The Commerce Department reported economic contraction in early 2025. Consumer confidence is falling, business investment is declining. The stock market, which initially shrugged off the tariffs, is now pricing in sustained uncertainty. And this is before we even get to the 2026 CUSMA review. That's the Canada-US-Mexico agreement, the trade deal that replaced NAFTA during Trump's first term. It's up for review next year, and the Trump administration has made clear it's willing to walk away from the entire agreement if it doesn't get the concessions it wants. If that happens, if the CUSMA exemptions that currently protect most trade disappear, economists are predicting a full-scale recession in Canada and significant economic damage in the United States. The worst-case scenario isn't some distant possibility. It's a negotiating stance that Trump has explicitly endorsed. He's said, repeatedly, that he's willing to let the deal collapse, that he's prepared to impose full tariffs on all North American trade, that he views the threat of economic devastation as legitimate leverage in negotiations. Here's what that would look like. Canada's GDP could shrink by 2.6%, roughly 78 billion Canadian dollars. That's not a rounding error, that's a depression-level contraction. Meanwhile, the US economy would shrink by 1.6%, about $467 billion. Americans would effectively be paying $1,300 per person per year for the privilege of economically punishing Canada. And for what? What is the actual policy goal here? Trump claims the tariffs are about border security, about stopping fentanyl and undocumented migrants. But the data shows overwhelmingly that those problems originate elsewhere. Canada isn't the source of America's fentanyl crisis. The drugs are coming from China, through Mexico, or being manufactured domestically. Illegal border crossings from Canada are minimal compared to the southern border. And in fact, the bigger problem recently has been Americans illegally entering Canada, not the other way around. So if the stated justifications don't hold up to scrutiny, what's really driving this? Some analysts believe it's purely transactional, that Trump genuinely thinks he can bully Canada into concessions on trade, dairy access, or other issues. Others think it's performative, red meat for a political base that responds to tough talk on trade. Still others worry it's something darker, a genuine belief that American power should be used to dominate and control, rather than to build and maintain alliances. Whatever the motivation, the consequences are real, they're measurable, and they're accelerating. Canadian businesses are diversifying away from the US market as fast as they can. Trade with Europe is growing, relationships with Asian markets are deepening. It's slow, it's difficult, but it's happening. Every Canadian business that finds a non-American buyer, every supply chain that gets reconfigured to avoid US tariffs, every investment that flows to a country that isn't the United States, that's economic capacity that won't easily come back, even if a future administration tries to repair the relationship. And it's not just Canada. Mexico is watching, Europe is watching, Japan, South Korea, Australia, every American ally is doing the same calculation. If the United States is willing to treat Canada this way, what happens to us if we fall out of favour? What guarantees do we have that American commitments mean anything? The answer, increasingly, is none. And so they're hedging, diversifying trade relationships, building alternative security arrangements, quietly preparing for a world where the United States is less central, less reliable, less essential than it's been since the end of World War II. That's the real cost of we don't need Canada, not the $62 billion trade deficit, not even the immediate economic damage from tariffs and retaliation. It's the long-term erosion of American influence, the slow but irreversible process of allies deciding they can't depend on the United States anymore. Because here's the thing about trust. It takes decades to build and moments to shatter. And once it's gone, it doesn't come back just because you want it to. You can't tweet your way back into being a reliable partner. You can't bluff and bully your way into the kind of deep economic integration that made North America one of the most prosperous regions on Earth. So where does this end? Honestly, I don't know. Maybe Trump backs down, declares victory over some minor concession, and trade normalises. Maybe Canada and the US stumble into a real economic crisis that forces both sides to de-escalate. Maybe the 2026 CUSMA review becomes an opportunity for a reset rather than a breaking point. But here's what I do know. Every day this continues, every time Trump repeats the fantasy that America doesn't need Canada, the economic damage compounds. Supply chains that took decades to build get dismantled in months. Relationships that weathered wars and recessions crumble over trade disputes that shouldn't even exist. Trust that generations of leaders carefully cultivated evaporates because one president decided that his gut feelings about trade deficits matter more than the actual structure of the North American economy. And when historians look back at this moment, when they try to understand how one of the most successful alliances in modern history deteriorated so quickly, they're going to point to that single sentence. We don't rely on Canada. 3 words that encapsulate everything wrong with treating international relations like a real estate negotiation, with confusing dependence for weakness, with believing that raw power can replace partnership. America might not think it needs Canada, but mathematics, unlike politics, doesn't care what you believe. The 4 million barrels of oil per day, the 98% of natural gas imports, the 82% of electricity imports, the $350 billion in exports. These numbers don't change because a president declares them irrelevant. They're the foundation of how the US economy actually functions, as opposed to how some people wish it functioned. And reality, sooner or later, always wins. If this breakdown helped you understand what's really happening beyond the headlines and the political theatre, hit that like button and subscribe for more in-depth analysis of the stories that actually matter. And in the comments, I'm genuinely curious. Do you think the US-Canada relationship can recover from this? Or are we watching something fundamental break in real time? Let me know what you think.